Thanks, Rosie, and thank you all for having me here for the last session of the day. I'm hoping I can leave you somewhat inspired after lunch. And speaking to Jane just in the crossover, I noted that the mood downstairs over lunch seemed really buoyant, and it had a really nice vibe to the place. And I think what I wanted to talk to you this afternoon was really around how we imagine new systems and how we work with hopeful action. And I think that will thread through a lot of the things that you've been thinking about today. So as Rosie said, I'm the director of MOD, so we're Australia's leading future-focused museum. I can say that because we're kind of the first, so we'll always be the leading one. And we're part of a movement of futures-oriented museums that are happening around the world globally. And I think it's interesting that we're one of the smaller ones. We get about 80,000 people through our doors a year. The big ones like Museum of the Future in Dubai, Futurum in Berlin get 1 million people through those doors a year. And yet worldwide, we are recognised as one of those leading institutions that's really shaping the way communities are building capacity for futures thinking. So I'm really pleased with the impact that we're having globally. And I'm really pleased to kind of see that emerging in the communities that we're working with. So we're particularly focused on young adults, so 15 to 25-year-olds, the audience. My reasoning for that is that anybody who's 12 thinks they're already 15. And we've worked hard to make sure that it does really hit the heart of that young adult audience. And so we do dissuade primary schools quite deliberately to allow those young adults to be in a space where they are searching for meaning in their own way with concepts that are suitable for that audience. About 30% of the audience that comes through is in that target age range, and for a museum that's incredibly unusual. That's usually the age that people don't come to museum environments and they don't participate. So we're really focused on thinking about that audience. And the two big questions we think that audience has are, where do I belong? Because they're making identity through their peers and they're trying to work out where their place is in the world and who they're like and what they're going to be like. And as part of the University of South Australia, our remit is to make sure they feel like they belong in tertiary study. And the University of South Australia has a strong access and equity driver to encourage first in family students to enrol, to participate in higher education, because we all know that education is transformational for people. But we also think that they're asking a question, not just where do I belong, but also who am I? And how do I make my own meaning in the world? How do I find the unique place where I can use my skills and talents to make a difference? And so what we're trying to do at MOD is help that young adult audience feel like they belong in education and learning, and feel like they are able to make sense of who they are. So it's beautiful work. Jane just said you must feel like you've got the best job in the world, and I keep saying I don't. My senior exhibitions manager, Lisa Bailey, has the best job in the world because she's designing the exhibitions. My job is often workplace health and safety and HR. But we have the best job in the world, I think, because we are working at such a important juncture of people's lives to help them make meaning about who they are and what they want to do. And so are you. And I think this shared work in changing the lives of young people and helping set people on a path of lifelong learning is really inspiring. And we probably have it a bit easier. We see people for an hour at a time. We're not with them, for years as they struggle and grow. But it's an enormous privilege, I think, to have that input into people's lives. And of course, they have input into us as well. So this photo that you're seeing is actually from our one of our events that our youth board helps design. So we have a youth board that consists of 10 young people, the moment they're aged 16 to 22. So crossing that border of school to university and work life. And they help us decide what kind of events they would like to come to and what kind of things they'd like to see programmed. So the next event that they've programmed is coming up in a couple of weeks, and it's got a unique mark. It's not like the one the youth board did last year. It's all very designed to be of what that group wants. And I think that two-way learning from each other, like we learn a lot from having those people engaged with us. We recently ran a Future Themes Forum, and there were a couple of schools. I'm not sure if we had Glenonga High there. We had Adelaide Botanic there. We had a couple of other schools that I can't recall at the moment, because I had asked kids not to come in uniform, just to come as themselves and to be participants to help us shape what the future themes of our exhibitions were. And they were there mixed with early career researchers and artists and industry leaders and a range of professionals all telling us what was important to think about when we think about the future, so that we can design exhibitions that are relevant and have meaning for the people that we're working with. So that two-way dialogue with that young adult audience is really critical for what we do. One of the things that I'd also mention to Jane is that we recognise that audience comes with knowledge. And as a science communicator, we're often undoing the mistakes of past science communication where the deficit model was really kind of the model. Let me tell you everything you need to know about science, and if I tell you that, you'll love it as much as I do. We know that doesn't work. I mean, it doesn't work for me. It's unlikely to work for anybody else. But I did a project a couple of years ago which was looking at how we might help young women who are pregnant make good decisions about food and nutrition. And we were doing that from a human-centred design process. And the assumption was that many young women who might not be in contact with the health system at early stage pregnancy, what we were observing was they were making difficult choices about food when they'd go out. So they'd say things like, I can't have the salad because that's got a bacterial infection risk, and I can't eat the tuna and I can't eat the sushi, I'll just have a bowl of chips. Which makes sense, right? But the results of that is that they're missing all of that valuable nutrition from fruits and vegetables. And so how do we get those messages across? And so the old-fashioned science communication way to do that is to say, here's everything you need to know about nutrition. But we know that's not working, and we know that people don't have time for that, nor are they interested in being lectured at. And so using the human-centred design principles, what we did is one of my colleagues we decided, where else do young women make decisions? And someone said, formal, school formal. What am I going to wear? And so one of my team members went to a boutique, and she walked in to sort of say, okay, how do we make decisions about what I'm going to wear? She walked into the boutique, and the boutique staff member said to her, what's your base, love? What's your base? What have you got? Have you got a nice necklace you want to wear? Have you got a great pair of shoes? And we were like, that's the thing, right? Our young people come to us with a base already, and by engaging them in conversation and learning from them about what they're already bringing, we have a much richer conversation than if we're just dumping knowledge on them. And so the way that we design MOD is to encourage the exchange of those conversations, to have that base there for both of us to interact and engage with. And I think of that conversation, I think of conversations with Sam Seller at the University of South Australia about funds of knowledge and the funds of knowledge that people bring into the classroom and the funds of knowledge that people bring into MOD, and a recognition that those knowledges come from very different types and ways of knowing, and how we respect and think about those types and ways of knowing is also important. So at the moment in the galleries, we're currently showcasing this touchscreen work by Carl Telfer, which really tells the story of the different seasons on Kaurna country. So coming to the end of the Kudlilla season, certainly we're at the end of Kudlilla today. You can smell the flowers in the air and Waludi's around the corner. But really thinking about that connection to being on Kaurna Yata and the important spiritual connection for Kaurna Minya, and thinking about what that means in Australia to have access to both Western and Aboriginal ways of knowing and Aboriginal knowledges. And so for us at MOD, bringing people into that place and showcasing Aboriginal culture as contemporary, ongoing, active, was something that we did when we first opened 5 or 6 years ago. And the landscape has changed a lot, I would say, in terms of how we are thinking about Aboriginal knowledges in everything that we do in Australia. And despite the hurt of the Voice referendum last year for many people, I think that has also sparked a resolution in many of us to say this work isn't finished. Like, this work is even more important than it might have been. So thinking about how we acknowledge country and how we connect people to place when they come in is, I think, an important part of really grounding people in what it means to be Australian and what it means to be South Australian and what it means to be on Kaurna Yata. The other thing that's our two-way, that's one of the ways we design, is through that two-way minded principle of being really conscious about bringing those knowledges into the space. The other way is about being connected to research and education. research and enterprise. And so this photo, which I love because it feels like a very futures kind of photo, is actually from a work last year called Traces of You by one of our UniSA creative staff members working with our interactive and virtual environments group. And it was an artwork that you could stand in front of and you could engage with a reflection of yourself, a digital self. And it was really an exploration thinking about the metaverse, thinking about how we interact with digital selves. This artwork prompted conversations around social media, around body dysmorphia, around creativity, around collective practice. It was a really interesting way of prompting a whole wide range of discussions, but one that was very much integrated into thinking about creative practice and the importance of creative practice. So, of course, the other thing that we do by showcasing research is think very clearly around scientific method and the exploration methods that we use to think about qualitative and quantitative research as well, and how we make meaning and how we make sense of the world. The combination of those things for me is through this artwork, which Auntie Sonia Rankin has helped us do, and this came out of a group of about 30 to 40 non-Aboriginal and Aboriginal people sitting together just after the referendum and saying, how do we have a conversation about futures where Aboriginal people thrive? How do we move past the closing the gap, the catch-up, the trying to be like each other conversations? And how do we move to a new conversation which really turns that inside out? And we did that by weaving. And so, excuse me for a sec. We did that by weaving, having conversations over the weaving, and letting those conversations emerge and letting us make collective understanding out of that conversation. And somebody said to me, oh, so you've recorded that, you've taken everything down, you've written it up? And I said, no, we haven't. Thanks, Jane. And quite deliberately, we've tried to use a non-Western way of coming at that knowledge making. We've tried to situate the memory of those discussions in the memory of story and in the memory of that artwork. And we've tried to make knowledge and think about the making of that knowledge in a different way, one that doesn't rely on it being documented and written. And that's a challenge, I think, to think about how we allow different ways of knowing into systems that have been set around a certain way of knowing for a while. So at MOD, we're consciously pulling up how we might think about bringing in First Nation knowledges, how we might think about that thread of Western knowledges, and how we might think about those new threads of creative practice and different ways of coming at things. Because that relates to funds of knowledge that people bring, but because also when you're sort of situating a world in what has been quite industrialised and quite scientific, we need new ways of being human in that world, and the exploration of creative practice and other ways of knowing that can't be dataified and quantified. I know that's not a word, and quantified, I think, is really important at this juncture. The other thing I wanted to talk today particularly was around this notion of hope. Like because we're aiming at that young adult audience, we're quite happy to do things that are a little bit challenging, a little bit difficult, a little bit uncomfortable. We're happy to stretch people to conversations that they might not have or they might not feel comfortable with. Some of you might have come to MOD when we first opened. Does anyone recall coming to MOD and seeing the babies? I've got a couple. Like I had a teacher from, I can't remember where he was now. I want to say Mount Gambier come through for a session a couple of weeks ago, and he came back and he said, I still remember those babies. He said, my wife and I were thinking about having children at the time and it's unsettled me ever since. And I'm like, this is quite an impact 5 years on to have something that makes you feel uncomfortable and that really challenges you. We had a year 11 student come to us after that and did her whole research project on looking at genetic modification of reproductive health, which I thought was really interesting. So we're happy to have those difficult conversations, but we don't want people, especially our young audience, leaving those doors feeling depressed, disengaged, overwhelmed, anxious. We want them feeling like there's a sense of hope, and we want them feeling like there's something that they can do. And so that's always been one of our practices. We think about the emotional journey as people come through the museum, and we try and make sure that we're leaving on something that makes them feel hopeful and not at sea. And we got a lot of conversations earlier about, well, a future-focused museum, you'll be doing a lot on climate change. And I'm like, well, to speak to any young person, they don't need to know about climate change. They've been hit over the head with it. They get it. They're angry. Like, they don't want to know about climate change. They want to know what we're doing about it. And so trying to think about some of those elements, about turning some of that big anxieties that we see in the discussions we're having around the existential threats of AI, and climate and mental health and loneliness and all of those things that come in waves for young people. We want young people to leave the galleries feeling like it's not just that's the narrative, there are other possible narratives. And so that's where the idea for the exhibition Broken came from. So Broken is our exhibition for 2024. It's open till the end of November. And it came from one of those future themes forums that I mentioned that we held in 2022. And maybe it was the post-COVID, oh my God, what is the world doing kind of mood. But the overwhelming feedback from that future themes forum was everything is broken. So democracy is failing, capitalism doesn't serve us, education's not fit for purpose, healthcare is going to be way over budget, I can't afford a house. Like, this was the thing that we were hearing. Every system that we've designed to support thriving communities is failing us, and we don't know where to go. And my team and I thought, yep, we hear you, we totally understand that. That's going to make for a really terrible exhibition. So what we wanted to do instead was we really dug into what are the future thinking skills that might help turn that narrative around. Like, how do we help people think about futures that aren't just a continuation or an inheritance of that broken narrative? How do we do things differently? And, part of this is assuming, I sort of said we are living in a complex present. The future is also going to be complex. It's not going to be any simpler. In the future, it will have this spectrum of things that are working really well and things that really need to be addressed. But at the moment, we are experiencing a crisis of imagination. And this comes out of some work from Nesta in the UK and a couple of other people who've sort of said there's almost like a convergence to the mean of thinking in our global connected world. And so we're kind of getting this, and you get this feeling when you've done too much on ChatGPT and it's giving you the same answer again and again and again. Like, there is a sameness to our imagining. When you ask people to imagine a different system to democracy, they say, well, it's the best, worst system, and there's nothing else. Or if you get people to imagine an alternative to capitalism, they say, well, the market is... Well, what else? So I think this crisis of imagination is really a challenge to us to go, if we feel like the systems are broken, how do we imagine new things? How do we imagine something that's different? And so there's a tool in Futures Thinking that, if you've heard me speak before, I've probably mentioned, which is the Futures Cone, and it helps us kind of expand our imagination. So when I talk about that inherited future or that future, that continuing narrative future, that's a probable future. So we're in late stage capitalism at the moment. We're going to be in late stage capitalism for the next 5 years. That kind of probabilistic, it's going to be more of the same with just more AI and hotter, is kind of the narrative about how we think the world's going to turn. But if we take that thing out a little bit further and we think bigger, there are a range of other plausible futures. So yeah, we might be a bit late on the renewable energy transition, and the next 20 years might be tough, but there is change happening, and we might see a change in the 30-year time frame. Can we imagine other plausible futures? Can we go wider to imagine preposterous futures? And preposterous futures are my favourite because they're the things that'll never happen. And I once did a session with SA Power Networks to a group of engineers and technologists, most of who'd been there for 40 years, and so there was a understanding that what had worked will work, in that kind of workforce. And one of the things that I got reported back to me after showing this cone was 3 months later they'd be in team meetings and, one of them would say, oh, I don't know, Gavin, it's a good idea, but it's not preposterous. And I'm just stuck with that idea about this idea of using preposterous as permission for play and permission to think differently. We did a teacher workshop a couple of years ago, and one of the things that we were doing was an activity called This Thing from the Future, where we're getting people to make artefacts from futures. You get 3 cards and it would say something like, in an X future, there is a Y which does Z. So in a wild future, there is a game related to food. And then you have to make that thing out of pipe cleaners and clay. And the teachers in that session were quite hesitant to make something because they didn't know if it would be right. And I'm like, it's first of all, it's the future, so it doesn't exist yet, so it can't be wrong. Secondly, no one's judging you on your arts and craft. And thirdly, just make it up, just play. And once we got them into the play zone, the ideas were amazing. But that permission, they said the kids will never do this. The students at our school won't do this because, they'll feel stupid. And I thought, we've got a long way to go if we haven't given ourselves permission to play with new ideas. And we're so hesitant to put something crazy out there because it might not be right. Because what we know from this diagram is that to work in the preposterous, we have to do crazy, we have to be willing to play, and we have to give ourselves permission to play where it can't be wrong, because wrong isn't the thing in this future. So some of the things that we're trying to do at MOD are giving people permission to enter other worlds. We don't want people to feel stupid in the way they're interacting in the museum, but we do want them to have this playfulness or this silliness or this preposterousness that they bring to the interactions, because we want people to basically push back against that crisis of imagination, and we want them to think differently. It's not what you know. So I always think about, when you're doing good futures thinking and you're trying to pick up trends and things that are emerging in the future that might create change, you've got to look for the things that you didn't know, which means you can't Google them. You can't ask Claude or ChatGPT because you're starting with something you know. You have to introduce randomness into your life. And so that means, going to weird events that you wouldn't go to. I keep saying I started becoming a boat racing official when my daughter was in year 10. That's been one of the most random things that I've pursued. I still go to the regattas and I still volunteer as a boat racing official, and I just got my Australian national accreditation, so I've taken it to extreme levels. But in those conversations, I'm working with people that I would never get a chance to meet in my workplace or my friendship groups or places that I've been. I'm meeting a range of people from all over the place, and it's, some of those friendships through rowing have been really great, but they've also, for me, that's been a 5-year masterclass in leadership. I've learned more about coaching, feedback, being able to think about, situational awareness than I ever have done through, 30 years of corporate work. And so that randomness about putting yourself into places that are unexpected and different, and really letting those things wash over you and finding those things that are special is part of moving towards the preposterous. So what we wanted to do at MOD with the Broken exhibition was really work on people's capacity to be preposterous and to imagine new ways of thinking. So what I wanted to do was just run you through some of the things that we've got in the gallery spaces and explain why we've done them the way that we've done them and what we're hoping to get out of them. So this is our universal gallery. And here we've got a game called Terra Nil, which is developed by a South African company. We found them on when it was sort of still in prototyping stage. It's now available on the Netflix system. We had nothing to do with them being picked up by Netflix. I just like to say it because it makes me feel like we've had some role in it. But Terra Nil is your classic city builder game, except you're trying to restore nature. And the provocation we wanted to have here was, what if we thought about building our cities where nature came first? So instead of looking at a piece of land, putting the building on and then putting the landscaping around the building, what happens if we start with the landscape and then create the buildings into the landscape? What does that look like? How do we rethink the way that we design cities that actually create spaces for nature, for us, because we're going to be better for it? What if we put country first? What if we thought about that deeply held relationship to country that Aboriginal people had? What if we put that first as the primary thing that we thought about before we started to develop land, or before we started to develop structures and community? And we know that a lot of the ways our cities have evolved and a lot of the way our roads have evolved is that they are sitting on places that have been visited or walked on for thousands and thousands of years, here, Europe, wherever you look. So what if we actually looked closely at the geography and closely at that biodiversity and that space before we make a decision? Because that changes your planning code. It changes the protection of nature. It changes a whole bunch of assumptions that we make about who owns land, how we do things. So how do we get people just thinking a little bit, reversely in the order of things? This was a crazy idea that somehow seems to be working, which is thinking about collaboration and what if people could actually work together for the long term without any reward, without seeing their efforts. So this is an analogy for climate action. We know that the work that we'll be doing today, we won't necessarily see the results of, but we still do the work. So, and yet we often hear that, it's not my responsibility, it's my children's responsibility. We often hear these things where people are deferring responsibility. But what if we get people to work together for the long term to create something beautiful? This was also a cheeky way to get maths into a STEM museum. So what we did was there's a shape that was discovered by mathematicians a year or so ago. This is the hat-shaped version. There's several of them, which is a non-repeating tessellated pattern shape. And so we decided it'd be really cool to tell that story. And we have an 80,000 piece puzzle. So we have 80,000 stickers of that hat shape in a non-repeating pattern. And we're halfway through the gallery opening, and the place is now half filled with these amazing pictures. The first word that people spelt out using those pictures, using those shapes in the same colour and placing them, was love. I was expecting so many other things, to be honest. And it just makes me so happy that that's the first word that we got. And you can just see the delight of people contributing and people thinking very thoughtfully about where they're going to put their piece and how they're going to do that. So that's been a really delightful kind of experiment in a big collaborative venture. And it really is about to inspire again, the assumption that we work only in self-interest as humans, and actually we don't. We work in service of love. And so to rethink the assumptions that we make about people. One of the things that you'll see when I refer to something a bit later is my team was completely puzzled that I wanted a giant... We've made a giant light sculpture in the foyer about taxation. It seems like them... But I'm obsessed with taxation because it changes our behaviour. And so the story I like is the only reason that ABBA has the costumes that they do is because of Swedish taxation, because you could get a tax rebate on costumes but not on clothing. And so taxation changes our behaviour. We are controlled by thinking about that, and yet we spend so little time actually looking at what that does. So we know it changes investment. We know it changes, where we study. We know it changes lots of things. It changes what we can afford. And so we really wanted to get people thinking about taxation as a shared commons for funding the things that we want. And so the sculpture has data around a whole lot of different categories like aged care and education and sports and leisure and energy, and it shows the public, private and volunteer value spending that goes into each of those things. So you look at something like aged care, and the volunteer cost in there is huge because it's people caring for elders, and yet it's almost invisible kind of in the economic system. And so if we could imagine an economic system that actually valued the true amount of caring work in the economy, or thought about those things in different ways, we might design different taxation. We might be able to afford things in different ways. So sculpture and taxation, it's my favourite. Housing was the other thing that kept coming up and up again. And so in this exhibit is really simple. It is a TV animation when you come in that describes the provocation. It's some examples of some things you might think about when you're thinking about housing. It's a couple of interactives so you can build your own house and think about how you balance some of the decisions around commute times and sustainability and family size. And then it's got some things where you can build your own house. It's very simple. I walk through and I think I could probably spend about 3 or 4 minutes in here. And we've seen people spend 30 to 45 minutes in there because they get stuck on the conversations about housing, and they get stuck on the conversations about the lives they'd like to live. So I stood there and listened to a young couple. They were each doing one of the interactives to design their own house. I think they weren't living together, but they were thinking about living together. And I shouldn't have been eavesdropping, but I was. That conversation was amazing because it just revealed a bunch of assumptions and values and concerns about how their life was going to go. And so this exhibition for me has been a real touchstone in terms of actually thinking about the importance of those conversations, beyond the narrative around housing and affordability, but actually the importance of housing and homes. This provocation makes the assumption that we've actually decoupled land from investment. We've returned all land to First Nations stewardship. And so you own land, but you are allocated housing depending on your needs. And so it's really around looking at kind of what needs you want, and then you can customise according to your needs. So we've been accused of not doing enough to solve the homelessness crisis, and we've also been accused of being communists. And so I think I'm very pleased with the preposterous nature of both of those criticisms. We also have a section on what could learning look like. And this comes from a phrase that we heard Martin Westwell say, and he was quoting someone else, but I can't recall the name of the other person, and I'm not going to quote Martin very well either. I'm glad he's still not here to check me. But it was something along the lines of, what if we just scrap, like Year 12 assessment is a complete waste of time. I'm sure he didn't say that. Year 12 assessment is a complete waste of time. The graduating question for Year 12 students should be, how are you going to use your skills and talents to solve the problems in the world that are important to you, and to do that in the right way? And if you can answer that question, then everything else is fixed. And I loved that. I just thought there is something in there which is around that, who am I and how do I navigate my future, and how do I contribute to the world in a positive way? And so we have this I'm going to be very honest here, this very weird installation that we've done by pairing our interactive and virtual environments team with Gongwonho, who are the land corporation for Yolngu country. And so you come in, because it also reflected a conversation that I'd had with Uncle Mark Coolmatri, Narangeri, man that we've been working with around some caring for country work, and he was talking about the concept of yonachi, the thing that you hold dear and that you would protect. So that might be thought of as a totem, or it might be thought of as, something that you've got charged to look after. But he was saying everybody's got something that's super important to them. I said, I think mine's the southern right whale, not the humpback. I don't care for humpbacks, but if there's a southern right whale down off the coast of Port Elliot, I'm there. And I just want to make sure they're okay. And he's like, that's yonachi. And what you should be doing is you should be donating to Save the Whales, essentially. That's your job to protect them. You shouldn't eat them. You should make sure that they're okay. And so there's this sense that there is a responsibility that we all have to do something in the world that comes from our very deep purpose. And if we can bring that out through learning, that maybe that's what education is supposed to do. And so in this interactive, we use that conversation with Mark and the conversation with Tommy from Yolngu country, and our audience draws the thing that matters most to them, how they want to use their skills and talent in the world on a piece of paper. It's scanned into this environment of Yolngu country, and it kind of goes out there as a gift. So it's a really nice way. People spend a lot of time in there. Some of the drawings are terrible. Some of the drawings are just rude and dirty. That's okay. They only last for 30 seconds. But it is meant to be this kind of gift, or this reflection on what is important around learning. And I think when you get to the heart of that, again, it prompts some really good conversations about what is learning for, and why do we learn. Democracy, as I said, was the other thing that came up again and again and again as feeling broken. And so we worked with experimental philosopher, I don't think that's a real thing, Jonathan Keats, who's based in California. And we've developed this interaction, which is what if the trees could vote, essentially? What if we could actually listen to non-human species? Because actually when you look at the biomass of the planet, we make up a very small percentage of the biomass. Over 90% of the biomass is vegetation. So we're making decisions for the health of the planet, but we're only a very small part of that. So what if we could listen to the trees and see how they would vote? So this interactive that you're looking at allows you to look at about 18 trees across the Adelaide region to choose a tree. We've worked with a company called Aerometrics, who does LiDAR scanning of environments. They were very confused when they first got our call, but they were very excited once we managed to make it all work. And we've used the LiDAR scanning data from Aerometrics, and my team has also been out measuring canopy cover. So you can look at a tree over a period. You can see whether that canopy cover has increased or decreased. And then you can look at all the legislation that was passed over that time period, and you can decide whether, based on the canopy cover change, the trees would have been in favour or not in favour of that legislation, and you can poll the trees, essentially to see if they would vote for the government again, whether they would make a change. So it's been quite delightful, quite mind-bending, to sort of get people thinking about how we might make decisions and how we might actually think about legal status of the environment, like our rivers and our forests, and how we might think beyond human nature when we're thinking about governance. The other one that we have on democracy, and this one is This one is my favourite. It's the most futurist one, I guess. And it's also the one that I really want the South Australian government to adopt. So I'm solely working on anyone who comes through the gallery spaces to get them to do this. But it's the idea of having thinking, like we know that a lot of our decisions in democracy are made on very short-term election cycles. So what if we could have a series of time commissioners that interrogated policy from a range of different timescales? So the one on the left, she is the Commissioner for Urgency. I think of her like Stephen Marshall during COVID. This is what's happening today. Right now, we need this right now. The next one is the Commissioner for the Senate. I think of her as Penny Wong, someone who's kind of carrying the electoral cycle, keeping charge of that sort of 5 to 10 year time frame. So yes, these things are actionable now, but we also just need to make sure we're not making swing decisions. The next one is the Commissioner for Children, like Helen Connolly. So thinking about that 20-year future for the generation that isn't yet able to speak for themselves. The next one is the Commissioner for Generations, and this comes from a concept from a futurist in the 60s called Elise Boulding, which he said, if we think about the present as 200 years, we make different decisions. Because if I stand in the middle of 200 years, I can imagine my grandparents, I know my grandparents, I can imagine my grandchildren. And if I'm making decisions for the generations that I know, I'm going to make different decisions. So the Commissioner for Generations is really holding that 100-year legacy and thinking about the next 100 years. And then our final one is the Commissioner for Deep Time. So he's doing that, but he's doing it for 60,000 years in the past and 60,000 years in the future. And it's just super interesting when you start to think from those different time perspectives. What's really exciting for me about this is that Democracy Co, who does a lot of public participation, civic participation, have just used this as a facilitation technique for a community in Victoria and got that community to think about their issues from different timeframes. And it opens up new possibilities. It opens up some of those preposterous futures. So I think it's a really nice technique to get people to voice what would the Commissioner for Generations say about this? What would the Commissioner for Urgency say? And a way of bringing different perspectives into the room that aren't just different cultural perspectives or different gender perspectives, but something that brings in that notion of time. So they're my favourite. Commissioner for Deep Time is my favourite, but they're all great. Within that futures cone, there is also this idea that of all of the futures we could... So I guess, those gallery spaces are trying to get us to imagine alternatives and trying to work with our audience on that skill of being able to imagine alternative futures. But within that cone, there is also the idea that within those, there are preferable futures. There are things that we deeply want to happen. By opening up that preposterous space, we have more space for the desired. Like we're not limited by what we think is going to happen. We have more space to create the type of futures that we want. And in this exhibition, the last gallery space actually has 6 case studies of where people have imagined new systems and are enacting new systems. So the message is meant to be that it's not impossible to imagine and create something different. Here are examples of where this is already happening. And the final part of the exhibition that I haven't mentioned is around hopeful action. So I said we want to leave people feeling hopeful, but hope's one of those words like peace and love that sound really, really soft, really unhelpful, like they don't have the strength and grit that actually they need to have. On my TikTok, I keep getting Keanu Reeves talking about being a fighter for love. That might just say more about me than anybody else. But love requires us to fight for it. It's not a passive thing. It requires input and it requires vulnerability and action and it requires hard work. The best love comes from having that depth of hard work. The best peace work comes not from hoping and wishing on a dove, but from doing active work to improve communication, to de-escalate, to solve, resolve past issues, to think about beliefs. It's hard, it's gritty. And the best hope work is the same. You don't just cross your fingers and hope, like that word implies. It actually requires us to be much more deliberate in our action to get to hope. And so in Broken, everybody gets a token when they come in. And as they go through the gallery spaces, they can answer questions using that token. And all of those questions are designed to start to get people familiar with the 4 levers of hope theory, which says actually this is how you do hope. It isn't just a wishful thinking. It's a thing that you can do. And those 4 levers of hope are, firstly, do you have a positive, engaging image of the future or a goal that draws you forward? And that's kind of where we messed up on climate change, because we said if we don't do this, it'll be dying polar bears. That's not hopeful. And when you ask people, what does it look like when we act on climate change, there's really no answer. Like the first answer I got was the big battery in Jamestown. I was like, that's what it looks like. That's what, and if that's the best we can do in terms of a hopeful climate future, we've got a long way to go. So do we have an image of the future, a goal that draws us forward, that is exciting and positive and compelling? Because that burning platform only does short spark change. It's not sustainable. So there's plenty of research that shows that, yes, you can pull people into action by giving them a burning platform, but it doesn't last. It's exhausting. We need positive, engaging images that sustain us. We need those big visions. The second one is, do you feel like you've got agency to make a difference? So for our young people, when we talk about climate and AI and, those things all feel overwhelming. But if we can think about that internal locus of control that we have around things, and we can think about what we do have agency on, yes, our actions by themselves might not make a difference, but we can act more hopefully if we know that we can make a difference to our own family or our friends or our community. And that there's faith that doing that together will have impact. The third one is, are there pathways? Are there multiple pathways? So if the first thing you try doesn't work, can you try another option? And so, that's where that preposterous thinking is really helpful, because it's not just one future, there's multiple futures. So anybody guiding Year 12s through SATAC decisions at the moment is thinking about those pathways, right? Like you can control the amount of effort you put in, but you also want to have multiple pathways if things don't work out. And then the final one is does that align with your own personal morals and values? Like, does it resonate for you? Are the things that you're thinking about important to you personally? And by putting those things together, you can start to give people a way of structuring hopeful action that isn't just crossing fingers, but actually has distinct things that you can do. And if one thing isn't working, try a different pathway, or shrink the scope of where you find yourself having agency, or reimagine the goal. And when you get to the end of the exhibition, all of those pathways of the audience are revealed, the choices that you made through the exhibition. And really that last one is showing you that we don't have to do it all. Like, not one person has to change the world. There are multiple ways of getting there. We all have a role to play, and our differences in terms of how we respond to that are all really important. And then each person gets a readout of who they are as a hopeful actor based on the way that they've gone through. So it's really nice to unpick that when people leave the gallery, to kind of go, here is the skills and talents that I think I have, and here's how I might contribute to the world. So the last thing I just wanted to mention is that on the table you've got our broken book. And as I was saying to Jane, the reason we did a book, which we don't usually, is that in making this exhibition and thinking about all of those alternatives, we had so many amazing discussions with researchers about the things that they were doing to imagine new systems. And we wanted to be able to capture that, to say, see, it's possible to imagine new systems, it's possible to imagine something different. So the book features short essays from academics, essays from Aboriginal writers and scholars thinking about bringing a different set of knowledges in, and it also features those 6 case studies that I told you about where people have actually made a difference. So there is a particular section on learning, but there are sections on housing and democracy and all of the things that I've mentioned. So we really wanted to be able to gift you that today as a bit of a reminder, or a bit of a prompt to think about how you might imagine your own new systems. And I know you've been doing a lot of that over the conference. How do you do things differently? How do you make the most of this opportunity to actually bring something new into life that's really going to be of service to the world? And then as a bit of a prompt to think about how you might sustain hope for yourselves as leaders, and also embed hope in the team and the students that you're working with. So I don't think I've got time for questions particularly, but if there are any comments or questions, then I'm happy to open the floor. Perfect. So, I'm happy to take comments as well, or reflections. There's one over there. If there's...
Yes, I think we're working.
Yep. So there's one just there. Yep.
In talking about hope, I wonder if we can frame our site learning plans in terms of hope instead of goal setting.
There is, I mean, I think that's a really, like that for me prompts a question around what sustains people. This is a bit of a tangent, but I moderated a talk at South Start a couple of years ago where a guy he'd gone to Burning Man, guy from Texas, and he'd invented a new religion. And the new religion was called the Solarians. And it was a planetary religion because he'd been having an argument with his with a colleague of his, and he was saying people really need, you know, in order to make decisions about something, people really need the facts. It's the facts that are going to help make the decisions. And she's like, no, it's all story. It's all story. Story is how people make decisions. And then he realised that the advantage of a religion was that that belief could never be disproved. And so the idea of believing in something that you actually can't disprove in any way is really powerful. And I've been using that a lot in my work about, you know, when I'm feeling like something is hard, then I just attach like a paranormal quality to it that I can't disprove, because it gives you a super strength, right? Like there's something about you, well, it's not logical, so it can't be debated. And there's something about hope. I think there's a goal is very practical, like it can be right, it can be wrong. Hope can't be wrong. And there's something about having something that can't be wrong that draws you forward, I think, in really amazing ways. It's tricking the subconscious and attaching story. But I'm using that technique a lot at the moment. To a little bit of delusion goes a long way, I think.
Any other questions? Thanks, Kristin. Mine isn't really a question, it's just an observation. It's on the back cover of the book that you have on your table. I just thought, and we were talking about this before, Kristin, weren't we, and Rosie, how amazing it is. Central to imagining alternative systems is the idea of hope, energetically fuelled by agency. And I thought, we've been talking about that over these 2 days, the agency that we have as leaders. We heard from our minister, we heard from our CE, we heard from Scott around what it is that we're in this perfect moment. It seems to me like that's a beautiful quote that I might take away from today.
Yes,
thank you.
Please, thank you. It's a good place to finish. Thank you very much.